Thank you, Bob, and thank you all. I always enjoy coming back to St. Louis. I don't treat you as flyover territory. It's very interesting to meet with folks here and learn how conditions are. Let me start, in fact, by finding out if anybody has been doing stimulus-funded construction work. And frankly, this is more hands going up than I typically see in a building chapter. I know in many parts of the country, highway contractors got stimulus work very quickly, but I think what we're going to be seeing more and more this year is that that stimulus money is showing up in other categories. And so I want to talk today about what's happening on the positive side. I had told some people that would be the first minute of the talk, but I think really I will be able to stretch it out a little longer than that. And beyond the pluses and minuses of construction activity, talk also about what's going on with construction materials and construction labor. And let's start first with the overall economic situation, that we are well past the recession. Now, it may not seem like that to people who are still in danger of losing their job or losing their house, but the broadest measure of economic activity, called real gross domestic product, has risen for the third and fourth quarters of 2009. In a couple of weeks, we'll get the first reading on the first quarter of 2010, and I think there's no doubt among economists that that's also going to be positive. There is some question whether we're in for a double dip or a W-shaped cycle. I don't think that's the case either. Now, I don't think it'll be a sharp rebound. Typically, you see the first year after a recession very strong growth. What we've had so far was a pretty anemic 2.2% increase in the third quarter, stronger 5.6% gain in the second quarter, but even that's not exceptional for this stage of recovery. And I think going through this year, it will remain pretty moderate, but it will also be pretty broad-based. However, there is one glaring exception, and unfortunately it's the one that you work in. Non-residential construction has really lagged the rest of the economy. There are a number of reasons for that. First, on the developer finance side, whether you're looking at office or hotel or retail or apartment construction, you have so many vacancies, such continuing drop in rental or room rates, that there's really very little demand for putting up more properties. And even if you have what you think is a good prospect for a project, it's really hard to find financing. On the state and local government side, the budget woes that have hit just about every state have forced states and local governments to cut out spending in many categories, and often it's easier to cut construction of something that hasn't been built yet than to fire people who are already on the payroll or cut benefits from people who are already in need. Well, counteracting that to a degree has been the stimulus legislation. This shows some of the 61 categories that AGC identified that were in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The total, $135 billion, is more than we've ever seen at one time in a single piece of federal legislation. But it has been slower coming out than a lot of people had expected. The highway piece, $27.5 billion, was allocated quite rapidly. And you know, here in Missouri, that your recently departed director of DOT was the very first. He was standing by a bridge in Tuscumbia the moment the president signed that legislation back in February 2009 and awarded the contract minutes later. Nice gimmick, but it did set the tone that the state DOTs generally jumped in. They all made the deadline of having all projects awarded by March 2nd of this year, and a good deal of that money has actually made its way into contractors' hands, and I think much of the rest will this year. But the other money scattered through these many categories was slower coming out, and there were a number of reasons for that. First, some of the programs were brand new, like the $18 billion for transit and rail includes $8 billion for so-called high-speed rail. Well, we don't have high-speed rail in this country, as any of you who've taken the train from here to Chicago or out west must be aware. So a program had to be designed, criteria under which states or groups of states could submit their bids. And then the Federal Railroad Administration took several months to evaluate those bids. It wasn't until the end of January that the President announced who was winning, and St. Louis and certainly the area from Chicago to Kansas City is one of the winners, but that doesn't mean the contractors are at work yet. We have another round of refining those proposals and seeing if enough money will come from other sources to make those projects viable. So it'll be several months yet before anybody is actually hired, far from that shovel ready that we had with the highway programs. Same thing with the so-called smart grid, which gets $4.4 billion of that $11 billion electrical grid category. A second issue was what I've called the embarrassment of riches problem. It's illustrated by the $5.55 billion for the GSA, the General Services Administration, which is the property manager and landlord for federal civilian agencies. That's supposed to go into mostly renovating federal office buildings and courthouses, but GSA was just swamped. They hadn't ever had that much money to put out, and they didn't have enough contracting personnel. So they told us at the beginning of October they'd only been able to award $1.1 billion in the fiscal year that ended last September 30th. The good news is they think they'll get out 3.8 or 9 billion by the end of this September. So building contractors should be benefiting more from that. Same with some of these other building pieces. The third issue, though, may be more intractable. That's illustrated by that $7.4 billion for water and wastewater treatment. All of the $135 billion here is supposed to be spent on U.S.-made iron, steel, and manufactured materials. But in the case of water and wastewater programs, we've starved those for so long that the advanced equipment is all either made outside the U.S. or at least has components that are made outside the U.S. and can't be spent unless the agency issues a waiver. EPA has issued project-specific waivers for about 30 different projects, but there are many more backed up. And this may also affect the high-speed rail, the broadband and wireless, perhaps the smart grid. But I am hopeful that the agencies are at least gradually getting up to speed on that. Well, besides the spending programs, there are a number of tax provisions in stimulus or in more recent legislation that have some effect on construction. Probably the one that has gotten the most attention is what started out as a tax credit for first-time home buyers, $8,000. That was supposed to expire at the end of November, but was renewed and extended through through contracts signed by the end of this month, April 30th, with closing by June 30th. And it was also broadened to apply to existing homeowners who want to buy another home. They're eligible for a $6,500 tax credit.